Hey guys, Argent here. So a lot of people probably say, RG, you're whining, you're complaining, you just need to pound the pavement, you just have to pull yourself up by your bootstraps, you just need to do this, you need to do that. I know, I've heard all that stuff before. This isn't really what this is about. This is about kind of expressing the perspective of my generation, our hopes and fears, as if you will, our pain, just how we view the world and why we are the way we are. And I think a lot of people criticize my generation, just blame us for everything, and just like to yell at us. Now, I think there's a certain degree of truth to something the left says, where they say, well, power is really required for blame. And this is kind of what they use to excuse the actions of people who, like minorities who kill people. They say, well, they don't have power in society, so you can't blame them. Or like racism or oppression requires power. And while the context they use that in is wrong, there's a certain amount of truth to it. It's fairly common nowadays, particularly for older people, to blame my generation for everything. The economy's not working because my generation's not working hard enough. Youth unemployment's high because my generation won't take jobs. My generation took degrees in the wrong thing. My generation aren't entrepreneurial, etc., etc. All of this ignores the fact that my generation really has no power, especially considering that we're smaller than the previous generation, so it'll be decades before we have the power to begin to vote for our own interests. Most of my generation doesn't even vote very much because they, I think, correctly realize that their votes really don't matter. The previous generation is so much larger, it can largely overwhelm us. Plus, the previous generation just votes more, so it's kind of an irrelevant issue. But my point is, my generation's not in power. Um, they can't really blame us for the way the world is, because we have no ability to change it. We didn't make it. We weren't in charge of the country for the last 20, 30 years. All the decisions that were made before we could even vote. So if you want to blame us, that's fine, but it wasn't under our watch. We had no control over any of this. To a certain extent, you don't have any control over how you're raised. You maybe have some control when you're an adult, particularly when the World War II generation is largely gone or has no real influence on society anymore. But my generation is just in our early 20s for a large point, and we've kind of inherited a world that makes it almost impossible for us to become adults compared to the kind of adults that one would see in previous generations. Now let's just go through a couple different things. Firstly, education. There's kind of this attitude of just blame millennials for everything. Say, well, it's your guys' fault. You didn't pick things that were in demand. You guys didn't pick career paths that were good. You guys just went to school. You got your liberal arts degree. It's your fault you can't get a job. You deserve to starve in the street. It's largely kind of the attitude that I receive. Okay, well, here's the question. Why did millennials get these degrees? Did the light just come on? I don't know, did Wotan show up and he's like, thou shalt go and getteth thy liberal arts degree? Did that happen? No. They were given advice. And who gave them their advice? The government, their teachers, their parents, authority figures, celebrities. Basically, everyone in society said, if you just go to university, then it doesn't even matter what you study. If you get a degree, and this is what I was told back when I was in high school, if you get a degree that tells employers that you have the basic skills necessary to do a job. Don't worry about extreme vocational training. Employers like to hire people, and then they'll train you. Well, after the Great Recession, training doesn't exist anymore. If you look at most, I'm sure people say, "Oh, I got training." Well, for the most part, at least in my experience, from what I've read and what I've talked to, they don't like to train people anymore. Training's a waste of time and resources. Because the market is so saturated with people who are overqualified, they can be extremely selective and only take people who have very specific experience profiles. If you look at a job application or a job posting, it'll often have like fantastical requirements. For entry level jobs now, they'll be like MBA preferred. You have to have like 5 different types of programming, all this other stuff. You have to know how to use all these programs. Could you probably just teach people some of that? Yeah. Most programs are fairly easy to use. You really just need someone to sit down with you for a day or two and kind of ease you into it, and then you can probably do it pretty well. A lot of things aren't really that complicated, especially for people who grew up around computers. But they're unwilling to do that. That's doesn't really take that much work, but it takes a little work, and a little work is too much for the hardworking baby boomers. Um, so yeah, so getting back to the main point. So my generation was basically told just go to school. You can learn hard skills later. What matters is soft skills. What matters is resiliency. What matters is creativity. What matters is the ability to think constructively. What matters is self-esteem. What matters is self-reliance. You can come up with this big long list of shit. Ultimately, though, employers don't give a crap about that, regardless of what they tell you. They want hard skills. The harder, the better. The whole thing on soft skills is a lie. And what pisses me off is the same baby boomers who tell you soft skills often run the businesses that won't hire you because you don't have hard skills. So that they largely are just kind of lying to you. So they told a generation, and the attitude, particularly among a lot of libertarians and conservatives, is, well, you should have known better. You should have, despite being family values guys, you shouldn't have listened to your parents. You shouldn't have listened to authority figures. You shouldn't have listened to people you're supposed to trust. You should have known that that stuff wouldn't have worked out, and you should have studied computer programming or science or business, etc. Well, in the business world, in a lot of cases now, you have to be a CPA or you have to be an MBA to even get entry level work. Um, or you can do a shitty job selling insurance, which is a commission based job, and it's kind of a pyramid scheme, if you ask me. So you can do that stuff. And I think that particular topic, and we'll get into some others, reveals kind of a misunderstanding of how these things work. They'll say, well, these jobs pay okay. Well, they don't really, but these jobs pay okay, and there's a need for them, so everyone should have done that. Well, if everyone had have done that, then there would be that wouldn't solve the problem. Maybe like 5 or 10% of the people who got BAs or social science degrees would be able to transition over there, but that there's not an unlimited number of spaces in the business sector for that sort of thing. You kind of get what I mean? Like the youth unemployment thing is such a big deal, and there's so many people who who could be reallocated to that sector. Either wages would massively go down, and the massive influx would mean that qualification requirements would go up even more, necessitating more school, or everything would just be filled. So I don't think that would solve the problem. And they'll say, well, why didn't people go to skilled trades? Because they pay a lot. Well, part of the reason that they pay so well is because there's a glut of them. If everybody who had a liberal arts degree went and learned a skilled trade, then wages would go down. As supply goes down and demand remains stable, price decreases. If my economic theory is correct, and people, okay, they're like, well, why are you going to programming and technology? Well, it probably is useful to know some programming. The issue is it's often required for jobs that don't need it. They're of course not willing to train anybody to do even the most basic functions of it. But the thing is, if you live in the developed world, you'll never be able to compete with someone from India. Um, Even if you have the same or better skills than them, what will happen is they can do your job for a tenth of what you can do it for. So they're like, well, learn all these skills, but there's, particularly with the internet, there's no reason they can't just get someone in a different country to do it for you. And where I live, at least, that's how skilled trades work. It costs too much for the government to subsidize or even write off taxes for someone to go to trade school. But it costs nothing for them to get someone to come from a different country and fill the position. And I believe there's often issues where they just let them do minimal requalification. They don't have to go through trade school again, etc. They basically have an education that costs maybe a 50th of what someone in Canada has, but they can just go right to work. And they will accept lower wages because they come from a different society. And even if they didn't accept lower wages, the excess of supply coming in reduces prices and makes it less likely for people to get into the field. So in Canada, you can go into that. Yeah, you're free to go into skilled trades, but just know that they're bringing in people who have more experience than you, who are older than you, and who have a lot of other advantages to you. And regardless of that, when people say my generation's entitled for this, they'll say, well, if you got your liberal arts degree, you have to go back to trade school. Okay, well, maybe you're like in your mid 20s. Maybe you've done your bachelor's and your master's. Maybe you think that you're entitled to have a job that is somewhat in line with what you studied, particularly since society promised you that. People say, well, that's selfish. You shouldn't demand what you were promised. What's a social contract? You're just entitled. You just don't want to work hard. Well, let's look at it from the perspective of these people. Millennials, in a lot of cases, were promised jobs or the ability to make a living in their field, whatever their field was, if they played the game, if they played ball. They gave, in many cases, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, if you're a lawyer, years of your life to study something, to do something, and they're being told, no, you aren't allowed to do that. You have to go back to school again, and you have to take another year or two to learn something completely different, completely unrelated, that may just be rendered obsolete anyways by automation or computers, or that you may be just replaced by an immigrant who will do it for less. And maybe I'm just going to be self-entitled and say I don't think that's really fair, and I don't think that's really a solution, and I don't really see why millennials should accept that. Certainly for people who might now who are going through high school, they should be told, hey, you might want to go into the trades or something. I have no issue with that. But telling people in their 20s, particularly when you complain that they're still living with their parents and that they haven't accomplished anything, hey guys, we know that you were sold this bill of goods, and we know you're in your mid 20s and you want to work, but you're going to have to wait till your 30s and then you might get some work. You might be able to actually start your career. Well, a lot of millennials are just like, fuck that. And this is kind of, I think, where a lot of cases where you get NEETs or people who are underemployed. Because they'll see the writing on the wall, as it were, and they'll be like, well, okay, I got my degree. There's no work in my field. A lot of times people will just give up. Because if a lot of baby boomers haven't been through the hiring process. They have no idea what hiring's like. A lot of them got their jobs, particularly in the public sector, before things like contracts were kind of the norm. Before online hiring systems, a lot of cases they'd walk in and talk to someone. And you often see this perspective. They're like, just walk in and say, I want to speak to the manager and sell yourself. Well, that's not how it works. I've tried that numerous times. They'll just say, go online through our shitty automated system. Take months to get back to you. Requires basically a PhD to pour coffee. Bullshit like that. You need a PhD to pour coffee. You need some sort of I don't know, just something crazy, and people will go through it and they'll get fucking jerked around. Like I remember one thing, I had to drive. I think it was an hour and a half to go to some obscure testing center. I had to write a 3.5 hour exam, which I passed and I did very well on, for a job, and then they said, no, sorry, it's been given to an internal candidate, meaning it was fake. The job never existed. So for me, that probably costs, I had to take a day off work to do that. So that probably cost me like, I don't know, a couple $100. So you have to spend a couple $100 for a job that never existed. Well, fuck that. People get sick of that shit. People get sick of having to fill out If you ever had to do with these applications, they just ask you the same questions over and over again. They ask you for resume, they ask you for cover letter. Some of them literally take hours. One I did made me read a full book and then answer a 300 question multiple choice test on it. For something that's going to be read by a computer and that you have a small chance of getting. So be like, well, network, etc. Well, people try that. That doesn't always work. I mean, it works for some people, it works for a lot of people. For other people, it doesn't. It depends on the industry, it depends what kind of company you're looking to work for, etc. Sometimes it can work, sometimes it can't work. I mean, I guess the idea is that everyone on Earth will network with each other. Um, but even then, a lot of the time, there's budget issues, they're not hiring, they don't know anyone who's hiring. Um, that kind of thing. So yeah, you can do the networking, but even then, they may like you, but they still often have very strict requirements for who they hire for a business, and they'll say, well, then just go work with your hands, go do construction, whatever. Well, that's kind of a very young man's game. That might have been good to do during high school or university, but once you're done, I don't see the purpose of basically saying, well, we're gonna use all these people who have all this education and make them do unskilled or semi-skilled labor. So a lot of people I know who have university degrees, often in things that aren't even that impractical, like biology maybe, or physics, or computer science, or programming, they can't get jobs in that field. So they just work full time or above full time at a minimum wage job to maybe be afford to rent a room. They can't really afford a car. They might be able to afford the crappiest car possible, and that combined with credit cards might allow them to live on their own. So a lot of them do is they say, well, the careers just aren't happening. I can't get a job really. I can't get my life started even if I get a job. And let's look at what happens if you do get a job. Housing prices are absurd. They keep going up, even adjusted for inflation. Rent prices are absurd. I was recently applying, and I'm going through the interview process for a job that pays 56 grand a year. I mean, that's pretty good if you're someone in your 20s, you're just getting started out. That's a pretty high salary. That's pretty far above. That's like 3 times minimum wage. So then I was looking at it. How much would an apartment cost if I moved out? An apartment without electricity in the Greater Toronto area, probably. And this is a bachelor apartment. This is like the cheapest apartment you can afford. You can buy costs about $1,100 to $1,200 normally without internet. Sorry, without internet, without electricity, without water. So added that on, it's probably $1,300 to $1,400 a month. If you look at your yearly income, that's probably after taxes about a quarter to a half, depending upon the nuances. So a quarter to half of your income after taxes goes to pay your rent, which is not tax deductible for some reason. If you live in the GTA, there's no public transit. If you live downtown Toronto, there is some, but if you live in any of the suburbs or outlying areas, there's no public transit. You basically need a car. They try to make it as unpleasant as possible to punish people, and I've heard them say this. We have to punish people for polluting the environment, but they're against improving public transit, building new trains, etc. So, like where I was looking to move to, even if I lived relatively close, like it would be 5 minutes by car to get to my work. If I wanted to be responsible and get a cheaper apartment further away, it would be 5 minutes by car and 50 minutes by bus, because that's just how slow and inefficient it is. So you go, okay, so if I wanted to move out, I'd have to get a car as well. And that combined with having to eat, even if I live very frugally, I would maybe break even. I would not be able to save any money. I would not be able to afford anything. I would barely be able to eat. I might be able to replace a couple clothes. I have no real way to kind of get ahead and save money and try to make a life for myself. So that's kind of where NEETs come from. They kind of see the writing on the wall. They're like, well, working will not really bring me much benefit. I can work, and I have to leave my parents, who probably make 2 or 3 times what I could ever make, who have largely paid off their house and their loans, or they're in so much debt they just completely blind to it, don't care anymore. So I could do that. I could move out and work at a job that probably won't go anywhere. Um, to basically just go into debt. So you go and you work and you go into debt, despite the fact that you're working full time or above full time, to pay for really crappy stuff. And I mean, if you I don't know who can afford things, because if you want to try to be responsible and not just keep going further and further into debt, that shit's really hard. Um, because like to pay for an apartment and a car, probably in a lot of cases costs more than you make, even if, let's say, you have a master's or a PhD, you can barely afford minimal living expenses. And that's interesting, kind of in this highly developed, modernized economy, that people can barely afford, in a lot of cases, the basic expenses of life. They'll be like, well, you can't buy any luxuries. You have to cut down on that. And the people who say that are often people who go on foreign vacations every year, maybe multiple foreign vacations every year, who buy all the latest stuff, etc. Who don't have to pay for their own medical care because they have that. They don't have to save money really for their retirement because they have pensions, which is something most people in my generation will never see. So a lot of NEETs just see that and they're like, "Fuck it." Maybe if I could move out, I could make some money. I could save up some to get a house. Maybe if I could make enough money to get married, have some kids, gradually build my life. But no, instead you literally kind of have to be a wage slave, and people will be like, "Well, that's just laziness." Well, it isn't. It's people often just don't see, even if you can't get a job, that it's really going to pay off for you. You may actually be in a worse financial situation than if you just stayed at home with your parents. So a lot of people just give up and do that. Maybe they'll work a couple hours a week to be able to afford their video games and Cheetos, but to a lot of people, they just don't see a purpose in trying. Um, the economy is rapidly shifting. The older generation fucking hates them. The system's rigged against them. Um, and they're just basically continually lectured by older people, that they need to change, that they need to get with the times. Well, why don't the baby boomers get with the times? Why don't they give millennials a chance? Why don't they hire them? Because they're basically saying, well, millennials are lazy, they won't work, but they make it almost impossible for them to get hired. They say millennials are lazy, but they've basically passed trillions of dollars of debt onto them to fund their lifestyle. They say millennials um, are excessive with their computers, where they take out second mortgages on their house to landscape. Um, the thing is, though, that they have power, and might makes right, as the saying goes. So long as my generation has no power and no strength, the baby boomers can basically just do whatever they want with us. They can run up the bill as much as they want. They can defer the costs of their spending. They can just keep blaming us. In the case of like Spain, where the youth unemployment rate's like 50%, there's really nothing that they can do. They have no financial power. They have no economic power. They have no political power. It just kind of go on and on until it can't go on anymore. And I don't think anybody wants to see what will happen when the system can't be sustained anymore. But that's more or less the world that's being built. And it's very scary. But the baby boomers, because they grew up during one of the wealthiest periods in human history, cannot see it. And so my generation will either be the next greatest generation who comes out of all this adversity stronger than ever, or it will become a bitter, devastated generation who takes out our fears and pain on those older than ourselves. So I hope you found that kind of interesting, just trying to explain a bit of the perspective. This is Argent Templar signing out.